Welcome, Maria. Good to be here chatting with you. Just to kick the conversation off, I wondered if you might share some exciting, interesting things that you're seeing happen in cities around climate mitigation and adaptation.
Thanks, Justin. It's a pleasure being with you. There's a lot of things that are happening that are very exciting in the city front. And I would say that we just released a report, the Aspen Institute just released a report called Education Uncapped. And in this report, we have been looking at 40 cities around the United States and looking at how they are integrating the education sector into their climate change planning. And we have seen really exciting examples of people being forward thinking about how they can tap into this sector to make sure that the city is climate ready. So for instance, in Austin, Texas, they have created a fellowship called the Climate Change Ambassadors. And it's a paid fellowship for folks from underserved communities, youth, educators, grassroots activists, and they are, the reason why they created this fellowship is because they want to make sure that their input is integrated in the city climate planning. So a true effort in cities and engagement to make sure that these diverse voices are included and these diverse perspectives are included. Another great example is in Albuquerque, in which they are integrating indigenous knowledge in traditional curriculum, in education curriculum, and also integrating gardening into the school curriculum to make sure that this traditional knowledge is also integrated into school curriculum. And then in Oklahoma City, there is an example of a city that is recognizing that they can become a true solar market. And they are integrating curriculum in partnership with community colleges and universities, local universities, to make sure that their youth and their workforce is trained to be competitive in the market, the solar market of the future. So just, a couple of examples. It's very exciting.
It's interesting. It's sort of embedded in some of the examples there, but obviously there's been a big focus on environmental justice, on an equitable and just transition. How do you think about that at cities? What are you seeing in cities to prioritize that?
Well, that's a really great question, because when you think about that, one in two, in terms of population, 1 in 2 people in the world live in a city. So half of the population over the entire population in the world lives in a city. So when you're thinking about how we're going to address climate change, you have to think about people first, because the cities is really where a lot of people are going to be affected by climate change. And also when you think about cities, they account for 70% of CO2 emissions. So you have a large concentration of people in a place, and also at the same time, cities is where economic opportunity is, and also where you see a lot of the inequality. So when you start adding all of these factors, it just makes sense to build this link between climate change and cities, and really thinking about climate actions through that urban and city lens.
Obviously, for many cities and municipalities, they're on tight budgets.
Yeah.
And they have to think about ways to integrate climate into their other planning. How much are you seeing this happen? What does that look like? What is your advice to cities that are struggling with this budgeting challenges?
One of the things that I like to think about budgets, because sometimes we think about budgets as a static thing, and the budget is an expression of the priorities of a city. And when you think about climate change and environmental justice, what we were talking about, you really have an opportunity to start investing, because just to take a step back, there's a lot of opportunity right now in terms of federal funds for investment in infrastructure, for investment in things that are going to make a real difference in people's lives. And this is such a tremendous opportunity to really focus and really target communities that have been underserved in the past. So I really see a huge opportunity in terms of righting the wrongs of the past through climate mitigation and adaptation, because we have an opportunity to rethink what our cities in the future are going to look like with this huge influx of investment of federal funds. So targeting communities, engaging communities in a meaningful way, and making sure that we are responding to the needs that these communities have. And while also planning to make sure that our cities are going to be more resilient and are going to adapt to a changing climate. I think that those two things can be done in parallel, well, together. And also, one of the things that I love is when you talk with environmental activists and environmental justice activists specifically, is that they tell you, I don't want you to come with solutions to my community because I know what solutions my community needs. The only thing I need is for you to listen to me. And I really like this perspective, because sometimes as experts, we come with ideas of what the community needs, but in reality, the best people to know what a community needs is the people who live there. So I'm really excited about when I see cities taking real action in engaging in dialogue with folks to understand what are your priorities? What are the things that are important to you? What are how is climate change affecting you? And then really getting their input and integrating that in their medium and long-term planning.
How do you ensure, I mean, there's oftentimes lots of different perspectives in a city, and sometimes one thing I've found in my reporting is that sometimes the most marginalized communities might have difficulty getting their voices heard when there are other communities that have a lot more money, resources, time to really spend engaging with the city. How do you ensure that those communities, those perhaps underrepresented communities, get their voices heard in city government and city leadership?
Well, I mean, there's so many things that you can do. I think that it's a two-way street, in my opinion. Like, you cannot necessarily only rely on the community to be the one pushing to be heard. There has to be an effort on the other side as well to make all of the services accessible, making sure that the services have quality, so people want to engage with cities and city government and trust them, right? Like, there's a trust building component that has to be happening there. Like, one of the experiences that I've had personally, I've worked for local government before, and I was engaged there because they had a huge area of, in the city where I worked, there was a huge area of the city that was mostly Spanish speakers, and no one in City Hall spoke Spanish. So I was, able to bridge that gap just because I am a Spanish speaker myself. But it really got me thinking with regards to how do I feel served by an institution that there's such a language barrier. So that was a huge eye-opening experience for me, in the sense of understanding that it has to be a two-way street. There has to be a willingness to engage and to understand one another, be it language, be it other, sometimes folks don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking in public. Like, that's not a natural expression of who they are, or that's not part of their culture. But then if the way to engage in the city is in, public meetings where you have to stand up and speak, that's, there's a whole layer there that I think, we need to be accommodating of each other's needs.
As you mentioned, in the U.S., there's this really interesting opportunity with all this federal money flowing to states, to cities. What are you seeing in terms of city engagement with the federal government in order to best get the money necessary to adapt and mitigate climate?
Well, I mean, there is, I think, on the one hand, one of the work that lays ahead, I think, in the coming years is making sure that we're building this bridge. Because even though the funds are there, it doesn't mean that cities necessarily know how to apply to these funds. Also, applying for grants at the federal level takes a skill. It takes also human resource capacity. So making sure that the cities are actually equipped to receive these federal funds is something that I think is important. Training is going to be necessary as well for municipal workers, to make sure that they know how to not only apply to these grants, but implement them. So I think that there's work to be I mean, I am very optimistic and excited to know that those funds are there. But I think that there is going to be a lot of efforts needed to make sure that cities can really take advantage of this. And there was one specific case, and I'm bringing it back to the education sector just because I have it fresh in my mind because of the report that we just released. Sometimes communities need to front some of the funds in order to be able to capture some of the federal funds. And this already tells you that there are cities that are going to be capable of doing that and other cities that are disadvantaged already with with not a lot of resources, that they're going to be at a disadvantage because they're not going to be able to put money up front. So just thinking, and this is, we saw this more in the education sector. So these are the kind of tweaks that I think are going to be necessary to make sure that the money flows to the places that need them the most.
So you've mentioned education a few times. I'm curious if you could zoom out to the sort of big picture. Why is it important for cities to focus on education around climate? What's the big opportunity?
I mean, I think that what gives me a lot of hope is that there are 50 million kids in the U.S. that are right now in K-12, kids and youth that are in. That's just a tremendous potential. And there is such a promise in making sure that all of these young people and children are going to be really the people who are going to be working to solve climate change. So empowering them, equipping them with education, with training to be able to face what it's going to look like, what the world's going to look like in a few years down the road. We are already seeing the effects of climate change now, and unless we take a lot of action, those effects are probably going to get worse. So making sure that our youth and our children are equipped and empowered to be able to face a changing climate, I think it's essential. Also, the education sector itself has such potential, because if you think about the number of buildings that are schools, the bus fleets around the country, making sure that we electrify them, making sure that we make those buildings resilient, that we make those buildings energy efficient. It's such an opportunity, making sure that there are sustainable food practices in school cafeterias. So it's a very, very exciting sector to be engaging with, to be thinking about, and such a potential for the sector to become a catalyst for climate action.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, very exciting. We talked about I asked about the federal opportunities. I'm curious a bit about the challenges that cities face, both with the federal government, the state government. Sometimes cities, I've reported on several different cities where, they've tried to change, say, their energy system and found that actually they don't have that much control because of the states, because of the federal government. How do cities combat some of the challenges of not having complete control over their energy system or other things that might have state or national regulation around it?
Well, I think it all boils down to partnerships and finding your allies. Yesterday we were listening to the governor of Maryland, and I was actually very excited to hear him say what he shared, which was he's going to make a point with a data-driven approach to target funds to the most disadvantaged communities in the state. So understanding that at state level you have such a partner and someone who is willing to put some of, a lot of political capital into making sure that these funds are going to be circulating to the right places, that's exciting to me. And I think that if I was in the position to be leading a city as a mayor or another form of leadership, of municipal leadership, I would be excited to know that I have such a partner at at a state level. And I think that at a federal level, you are seeing those signals as well. There is a true commitment in this administration to making sure that there is investment in infrastructure, and there are funds that are available for municipalities to really adapt to a changing climate and to really mitigate the effects of climate change in their infrastructure, in their communities. So I think that identifying those allies and keeping those good initiatives going is what is going to support cities the most, because no one can do this by themselves. Like, cities are not operating in a vacuum. So I think that strengthening those partnerships and identifying those allies is going to be essential.
Well, I'm just curious, maybe to close, I'm curious your perspective thinking about how, I remember the involvement of cities, say at the 2015 COP, and just sort of as an inkling where people were starting to wrap their heads around the idea that cities needed to be involved in this conversation. And now there's giant movement, in part organized by folks like you around this. I'm curious, where do you see things in that sort of arc, that trajectory? Where do you see things going? How much do you think that cities around the globe have woken up to this climate challenge?
I love that question, Justin, because one of the things that I'm most excited about the work that I am doing and that my team is doing at Aspen is Aspen Ideas Climate. And it is not a coincidence that the person who approached us to partner with us to create a climate event was a mayor. The mayor of Miami Beach, someone who is leading a community that really is feeling the effects of climate change. So I think that sort of local approach is what is very concrete for people. Like, people feel climate change in their cities. Like, that is really where it's most palpable. So I am seeing more and more mayors trying to really get involved into. I think that before we thought it was a global problem and it felt that it was really far away. And now that folks are seeing the heat waves and how it impacts the infrastructure, how it interrupts school, how it really puts a weight on local infrastructure. I'm thinking about flooding. I'm thinking, so all of these environmental impacts. So the fact that local leaders are taking much more active action and are not necessarily waiting for someone, at another level of government to come with solution. I think that that's exciting. There's, as you said, a huge coalition of mayors in the US, but also around the world, who are coming together at spaces like COP, spaces like Aspen Ideas Climate, to share solutions, right? Like, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can borrow good practices from another city that might be facing similar challenges as you are, and then just share examples. I think that there is true strength in numbers, and people are finding that. And I just always say that climate change is the kind of problem that you need all hands on deck. So I am excited to see more and more folks getting engaged and getting excited about, not necessarily overwhelmed about what this huge collective challenge is, but also getting excited that there are solutions and there are things that we can do to address it and make sure that people have a healthy and prosperous and resilient and also equitable environment in which they live and thrive.
Well, thank you, Maria. Great note to end on. Pleasure talking with you.
Likewise, a pleasure talking with you too.